Hey there, fellow creators. Ben here from Cinder Studios, and whether you're painting on canvas, on wood, on some other support entirely, it's really important that you know exactly what you're painting on before you get started. For the first brush stroke to the last, painting surface prep is super important. So for acrylic painting, this is the ultimate guide to painting surface prep. Stick around. So your painting surface or support is often referred to as a substrate. And why? But you might think, all right, so I just go to the store and buy a canvas or wood panel or something, but why is prepping that surface really that important? Now, something like an off-the-shelf canvas, for a lot of artists, it's very much a preference to add additional gesso or sand that canvas down a little bit more. But do note that this is strictly a preference. A lot of artists will tell you, oh, you absolutely have to add a layer of gesso to a canvas you buy off the shelf. You don't. It's a preference. That is all. Now for a custom support, something you're stretching yourself like a canvas, found wood supports, stuff like that, it's really important to sand that down, hit it with a layer of seal coat, something such as a medium or a gel or a gesso, to make sure that that piece is ready to accept paint. And whereas an off-the-shelf canvas or wood panel, you can just go right into painting usually. Anything you do yourself, that sealer coat is an absolute must. A properly gessoed canvas or sealed wood panel will make sure that your paint is adhering properly to that surface, as well as ensures longevity for the piece overall. Unsealed or unprimed surfaces can cause paint to flake or chip off the support. It can deteriorate a lot faster, or it can absorb too much into that specific surface. Okay, so let's break down some actual preparation tips here. Now, as already mentioned, a sealed off-the-shelf canvas you buy at the store is already gessoed and does not require additional gesso or any kind of groundwork unless you so desire. Now, loose canvas that isn't going to be stretched or not going to be displayed as stretched, so it might be just a loose piece of canvas on a wall, if you're still planning on gessoing that, and you should still do some sort of an initial base layer stretch. It doesn't have to be all the way across bars, but, pulled between a couple of pieces of wood or something, just to be sure that there's no warping or any kind of a distortion when you gesso that canvas, because if you gesso canvas that isn't stretched, it tends to buckle. For a stretched canvas, the ideal primer for acrylic painting would be acrylic gesso. Now, of course, you can use acrylic primers for oil paintings, but there's also oil primers for that, but that's a whole other topic for a whole other day. And of course, ideally, if you're brushing gesso into raw canvas, you probably want to do just that, brush it. Now, the stuff made in the store is usually spray applied, but to do any kind of large-scale application of spraying of gesso isn't really practical for the everyday artist. And for a nice high-quality, sort of big bucket of gesso kind of stuff, anything with a nice thick artist or professional quality, you can actually get away with a single coat of it. I don't really recommend that. I recommend at least 2, probably up to 5, depending on how smooth you want it. Make sure that these layers are dried in between. You sand in between those layers, and then just build that texture up to your desired texture. Now, additionally, a clear gesso can be used, or a black gesso instead of the white. I do generally recommend, though, that you start with a layer of white gesso and then either tint it or tone it otherwise. Of course, now if you're using clear gesso, or in fact, you could probably use like an acrylic polymer medium or something like that to steel that canvas surface and keep that sort of raw tan kind of color that canvas has when it's raw. But do note that if you're going to do that, then you'll need notably more medium than you would when you're painting, so it tends to be a little bit more wasteful that way. So which is why it's usually better to use like a clear gesso rather than a medium, at least for canvas. Now when it comes to wood panels, you do tend to have a few more options. First off, wood panels, depending on where you buy them, they can either come pre-gessoed, or you can find just basic pieces of wood wrapped in plastic that come right from the manufacturer that way. These pre-manufactured panels are unprimed and unsealed and definitely need a little bit of prep work. At the very least, you should give the panel a little bit of a light sanding before you get started. You don't necessarily have to seal the coat, but again, I do highly recommend it. At the very least, some of that acrylic polymer medium if you're not using gesso. But interesting, a lot of artists actually prefer the raw wood grain because of the way the paint soaks into the wood. Now, do note that if you're using acrylics, that's not really a problem. If you're using oils, it can deteriorate the wood a little bit if you're just painting raw oil on wood, which is, again, why sealing that surface is kind of more important. And as I've already mentioned, sanding is really important for wood. I mean, again, simple light sand to create the desired texture. as well as be sure that the paint is adhering properly to that support. Now, if you're using like a found wood support or something that's a little bit less standard, it is important to note that sometimes you will need to do a little more, sometimes heavy sanding to get that panel closer to where it needs to be before you even take any medium or gesso to it. Now, in addition to canvas and wood, another very common support for a lot of painters is just painting on paper. Now, you can choose something like a watercolor paper, especially I would say like 140-pound cold press is a lot of times my go-to for a lot of demos here on this channel when talking about acrylic paintings. But there are specialty papers out there as well. Strathmore makes an acrylic paper. I plan on highlighting this in a future video, so look forward to that. Generally speaking, though, if you're, again, taking paint to paper, you're going to want something thick. So 140-pound like watercolor paper as I would say, a base minimum. I also really like working on bristle paper occasionally, but similar to like painting with watercolor, you want to tape down your edges, stretch that paper out, usually on a hard surface to be sure you're not getting any kind of warping the way you would with raw canvas. Though do note, if you're planning on painting thick, don't paint on paper. Paper, in grand scheme of things, is not really designed for heavy impasto work. So if you're going to be like, I'm going to use a paper and do a bunch of palette knife work, maybe pick like a canvas board up or something for that, and don't work on paper, because the paper's going to go all crazy. Now, those are the more traditional supports, but what about something a little bit more non-traditional? How would you pick some random object up and go, I think I want to paint on this, but what do I have to do to that surface? And there's a lot of different ones out there. Now, once again, acrylic mediums and gels are sort of my go-to for prepping strange supports. So something like the JC100, an acrylic polymer medium, works really well. Gloss and matte gels, also really, really good for that. A big favorite of mine is Golden's fine pumice gel because it gives a little bit of a tooth and a texture. But you can kind of use whatever acrylic gel or medium that you really want to for this. Now, I specifically sell a gel or medium because they are clear. You're going to be able to see that underlying support. You can use gesso instead of the gels or mediums, but again, that's going to make your surface white, and that kind of, you lose a little bit of the allure of that found support when you just slap white on top of it. Now, with a found support, much like canvas and wood, sanding is important, but not all found supports can be sanded, which is why, again, just simply clean it up real good, hit it with a wet rag, occasionally some disinfectant if need be, and then just some acrylic gel or medium will do the work for you. But yeah, not everything can be sanded. And again, it's a found support, but you got to know that going in. And I assume you would if you picked it up and said, I want to paint on this. But also, not everything can be sanded based on the material that it's made out of. Now, real quick, here's 4 unusual surfaces that I paint on a fairly regular basis, and here's what I did to prep them. The first one is unusual wood. This was a big slice of a tree that I cut down. It's a little warped, as you can see. This had a few layers of prep on it. There were big cracks where the wood had dried, so I filled those in with acrylic gel, and then a few layers of the fine pumice gel that was then sanded down to give myself a slightly textured surface, but it's still smooth and uniform all the way across. Well, as uniform as it can be anyway. This is closer to a wood panel, but this is another one I'm working on. This is a just long slice of wood, sort of like a wood board, but it has all of that gnarly texture of the bark. Now, the gnarly bark texture, I didn't really touch, at least not for the most part. If you're going to stain any kind of wood that you have, you stain it before you do any kind of seal coating work. If you try to seal, or if you try to stain on top of the seal, the stain will just sit on top of that acrylic gel. So if you're going to stain something, sand, stain, gel, sand. Now you're good to go. Another common one for me is roofing slate or ceramic tile. Obviously you can't sand down those surfaces, but especially if it's roofing slate, something that's been sitting in the back of someone's yard or on top of a roof forever, it might be moldy, it might be covered in dirt and dust. So nice solid cleaning on that, and then go in, depending on how the slate or tile is, you can use the gel to take out a lot of the divots and holes and anything like that. There's a hole in this one. This will get filled with gel, and then it'll get seal coated either with the GAC or the pumice gel in order to be sure that's prepped and ready to go to paint on. Now, it should be noted with a tile or a slate, in theory, you don't have to completely seal it. but I still do in order to make sure that the paint adheres properly and doesn't flake or chip off over time, as the stone will, especially the slate, will flake and chip as it ages and dries. Ceramic tile, not so much, but you still run that risk if you don't seal the support. And the last of these unusual supports is glass. Now, I use glass palettes specifically because you can scrape them clean and get the paint off super easily. But what if you want paint to stick to glass, like actually stick and stay? I paint glass bottles a lot, and occasionally do some sculptural work on top of them as well. But what's interesting about glass is because glass and acrylic, and they're not really compatible, and very easily could chip off, this is where a specialty medium comes in handy. Golden makes a product called the GAC 200. It promotes adhesion and film hardness. This stuff dries super fast. I usually apply it with a paper towel. But a quick layer of this stuff on top of a glass bottle immediately makes it a good possible surface for painting with acrylics on. If you want to see a quick project for these, I have a video I put out, I think last year, where I talked about painting a little scene on a glass jar such as this. This is actually the exact one I made in that video. And that's exactly the same thing. A quick layer of the GAC 200 and you're ready to go. So whether somebody else prepped your work in a factory and you're just buying a canvas off the shelf, or if you're prepping some found wood support, it's vitally important to be sure that you have a solid ground to paint on before you get started. This will make sure that your work looks the best and lasts a long time. Remember that you're not just limited to a traditional white gesso. You use black gesso, there's clear gesso. And you can also use acrylic gels, mediums, and pastes to do the same work that gesso does. So you're not just limited to a traditional white slap of white over top of traditional or non-traditional surfaces. Now, while I do call this the ultimate guide of painting surface prep for acrylic, there is a little more nuance, of course. The vast majority of stuff, it's clean it, sand it, prime it, paint it. Or prime it, sand it, paint it in some cases. And as long as you follow by that basic principle, you can paint on just about whatever you want. But I'm curious, based on the few things that I talked about today, being canvas, wood, paper, and a handful of the found supports that I paint on periodically, did I miss anything? Have you guys painted on something, other new and interesting things that I maybe haven't tried? Also, I just realized you can paint on plastic, but same deal. Spray coats, I would actually recommend the GAC 200 if you're painting on like a smooth plastic. But still, is there anything that you painted on that maybe these tips didn't cover? If you have or have tried and failed, let me know in comments, and I'll try to help you out there to maybe get you to the point where that sort of prep makes sure that you can then paint in the future. That was a mouthful. I should probably do that again, but I'm not going to because I'm on a roll. So that's going to be it for this video. Thanks, guys, for watching. This has been Cinder Studios. Keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time. Oh yeah, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff too. Community Discord in the description. I didn't record last week, so everything's all out of whack. If you stuck around to the end, here's a weird one that I didn't talk about because I'm still working on it. Old circuit boards. This is a lot of acrylic gel, and it's screwed to a piece of wood, so we'll see. Future video, maybe.